Hello and welcome to part 7 of Reclaiming Marx's Capital, the TSSI series. We have got quite a full panel here today. Let's do some introductions. Who will we go to first? Let's go to the table meister, Emmanuel. Emmanuel, how are you today?
I am fantastic, Tom. How are you?
Not too bad.
Looking forward to talking about simultaneous valuation once again.
Once again. We should just re-record, just put out the same episode 6 times. Nobody would notice. Now, over next, we've got C. Derek Barn over there in the beautiful state of Utah with his Mormon friends. Derek, how's it going?
Pretty good. And yeah, the answer to the question of the chapter is no.
No, there you go. All the way from Utah. Thanks for that, Derek. Very concise. Gregory Chaitan will be proud of that algorithmic information and density. Now, next over to Lexi, who is over in, I don't know where Lexi is. Lexi, tell us where the hell you are.
I'm on the East Coast. I'm around New York City. That's about as specific as I'm going to get.
You're going as specific as you're going to get, or as you're going to tell us?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, and lastly but not least, we have got a return to the pod of the mashed up Marx figure, who is Puya. Puya, how are you?
Hello, Tom. I'm doing well. How about you?
I am excellent. Now, ready and raring to get into chapter 6. It's been too long. We missed last week. We were all a bit tired and emotional after the previous week. Still had a few tables to get together for the last episode. So we're into chapter 6 here. And this chapter is called Was Marx a Simultaneist? Now, who wants to take the introduction today? I put forward Emmanuel. There you go.
Yeah, I could do it. Right. So just like in the last episode where we said that if you are convinced that simultaneous valuation ends up in physicalism, and it's not compatible with Marx because of, equating past and future values, then just go ahead and skip the entirety of chapter 5. Likewise, this chapter deals with whether or not Marx actually himself held or prescribed to simultaneous conceptions and had a simultaneous theory. And if you think that sounds unlikely, seeing as how it leads to things that necessarily contradicts his theory, then you can go ahead and skip this too. However, if you're not convinced, Andrew is going to go through some textual support. He's going to repeat some arguments that he made back in chapter 4 about charitable interpretation. And he's going to make an annoyingly persuasive case why Marx couldn't have been a simultaneist. So this is for those of you who are still unconvinced. And by the end of this chapter, I think it's just, he almost goes into overkill. It's like, beating a dead horse almost. But yeah, that's pretty much chapter 6. The answer to which, as Derek said, is no. Or at least it would be very improbable.
Yeah, the name of the chapter is Was Marx a Simultaneist? And that being the question.
Which is kind of it could almost be like a scientific joke, because in science papers, particularly in psychology, whenever an article or a research paper has the title of a question, the answer is always no, because otherwise you just state whatever you found as the.
It's a very similar tendency in journalism.
Oh yeah.
There's one line here I think that's good in this little introduction. It says, if his value theory is consistent, then its theoretical premises cannot be simultaneous. If conversely Marx did employ simultaneous premises, then his theory must be inconsistent. Like, that's the chapter, I think, rolled up, isn't it? I like that line.
More or less. I think the next section kind of pulls out a little more of why he's so, he's seemingly so absolutist about this. Like, if you just look at his conclusions, you're not looking at how he gets there. Because I think his method in this chapter, and again, we're gonna start going over the math, and listeners will understand why that's not the crux of a lot of our intuitions here. But the basic point that emerges in the second section is that all Kleiman really needs to show is that the passages in question, the ones that are brought out by Simultaneous as proving that Marx thinks their way, Kleiman doesn't say that he has to prove that that's not how you can read it. He says, all I have to do is prove that you can read it in this other way, in this temporalist way. And because of the logical inconsistency underneath simultaneous Marxism, then the temporal interpretation just trumps it because it makes sense of the text. So it's fine that, yes, there's ambiguity in Marx's prose.
Yeah, so since we're not reading a work of literature, in that sense, the charity of heuristic, the charity of heuristics, the heuristic of charity would mean you always pick the logical, consistent reading because that's more charitable to the author and also just makes more sense. And so then it would automatically lead you to pick that the temporal system doesn't lead to the inconsistencies. Therefore, if we apply the heuristic of charity, we don't need to prove that you can't read it another way. We just need to prove that the other way leads to all these other problems. This doesn't. Therefore, the more consistent reading is where you should go. And you'd be surprised that seems like utterly intuitive, but it's actually not taught that much. And what surprised me about this debate in a way is that I would expect that to be a mistake that like weird literature people make, that like Frederick Jameson's literary theory of Das Kapital or whatever, but it seems to be a consistent thing amongst people who should know better.
Well, my opinion.
And another thing that comes up in this chapter on like interpretation, etc., is whether or not you should like hone in and zoom in on this one time that Marx says something that could be said to support the simultaneous interpretation, or whether you should look at his whole body of work and his theory as a whole and try to extract the meaning of those specific quotes from the context of the whole body of work, or if you should like be nitpicky and like, well, Marx kind of says that he's a simultaneist in this one sentence, and so therefore, Andrew, you're wrong. And so that's also a question that he deals with.
Yeah, the exact wording, such interpretation should be rejected if they at first, such being ones that lead to inconsistency, seem to some readers to result in a more natural reading of this and that contested passage taken in isolation. If the alternative interpretation was true, arbitrary, or forced, they could explain one way or another the individual case of inconsistency. Yet because it is so difficult to make various parts of the text fit together into a coherent whole, it is highly implausible that an interpretation establishes a textual coherence is a congruity of ad hoc apologetics on the author's behalf. No. So in other words, don't proof text for your theory in a way that would make everything else make no sense.
I was looking for a quote that I thought was such a good burn in this chapter, and I couldn't find it. But now Tom highlighted it on the last. There on the claim that he
was going to read the same thing.
What would we need? What would we need to accept? Would we need to throw out the baby with the bathwater, as it were, if we are to accept that Marx was a simultaneous? And he just goes through this fucking burn, which is insane. I laughed out loud when I read it.
Yeah.
Let's read it. Let's read it.
I forget. I forget because we mentioned this in an episode before, and I forget what it was, but I was describing my experience with analytical Marxism and Karl Marx's theory of history and being like, whoa, this is such a cool reconstruction. It really does a good job of putting Marx's intuitions on solid ground. And then you turn to these kinds of Marxist economics, and then you find the rate of profit falls under circumstances in which his own simultaneous premises imply it must rise. Surplus labor is the exclusive source of profit, although his simultaneous premises imply that it is not. Value is determined by labor time, although his simultaneous premises imply that labor time is redundant. That just does nothing.
Well, the
to
most
model
important thing
Marx.
there, the most important thing is these three words that you left out there. See,
Oh yes,
and so on.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so on and so on.
Well, and that goes double for the political implications of the economic theory. Like how many? This is boilerplate, right? But how many times is Marx propped up for politics he would have probably tried to personally destroy?
Yeah, hugely. An awful lot. It's interesting because I'm reading that book that Puya put us onto, the Grossman one. What is it? The breakdown theory,
Well,
whatever it's called.
The law of
And-
accumulation and breakdown of the capitalist system.
That's the one. And
Mhm.
it's interesting in that because in that he spends a lot of time talking about, like, the technical the difference between the organic composition of capital and, say, the technological state of a society. And he's trying to talk about getting into this idea of scientific socialism and how that the falling rate of profit links into what Marx's thoughts were about socialism or communism being the next stage of development of human society. And it seems to me like I wouldn't be surprised if, because of the disasters of the communist experiment of the 20th century, that a lot of them feel like some kind of want to just escape from that element of scientific socialism.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like they feel like they want to throw out the falling rate of profit and all that entails. I don't know what people think about that.
Maybe
Resounding.
No. I mean that broadly comports with my feelings. I think we should move on.
Yep. Okay, that's for it. Okay. Well, we've had a look through. We haven't missed any good stuff in this section 6.2, have we?
No, I mean, other than the fact he says, I already said this in chapter 4 twice.
Excellent. Keep it up, Derek. This will make it a short episode. Now we go into chapter 6.3. Now this is a part of the book that I think is, well, there are some problems with. There is some mathematical stuff in it that I've emailed Andrew about, wondering how we got the stuff, how we worked out those equations, and he says he can't remember, and also that there is an error in the equations. So we won't get into the equations bit too much, but I think we'll discuss just the general idea and leave it at that without going into the maths. Does anybody have any objections to that?
No, I think the math is confusing, and it, as you stated, is quite possibly erroneously printed, so it would be nearly impossible to fix anyway. So let's just state this in words.
Okay. Well, Emmanuel, you before we started, you said you kind of would like to, or had a good grasp of this stuff. So do you want to have a go at this part? And yeah,
sure. Okay. So the idea here is that some people claim that Marx was an equilibrium theorist, i.e., that over time, rates of profit would tend towards an equilibrium, such as we saw in one of our earlier episodes back in table 2.2, how the price rate of profit and how the value rate of profit equalized. And so that's sort of a point of contention. Was Marx an equilibrium theorist? And Andrew says no. And some other theorists say yes, and they both refer to the same thing, that Marx all of the time talks about averages. So the thing you've highlighted there, I think, is really illuminating. Where he says many simultaneous authors, especially Straussians, argue in addition that Marx's prices of production and general rate of profit are static equilibrium magnitudes. The prices and rate of profit that would prevail in a situation in which there is no tendency for anything in the economy to change. But if prices are not changing, then input and output prices are equal. So that's a sort of a conclusion from that premise. Thus, on this interpretation, Marx's prices of production are simultaneously determined. So without going too much into all the implications of this, the core question is, what does Marx mean by average, right? Does he mean a tendency for things to equalize in the long run? Or does he mean by average an average? So in order to illustrate this, instead of the confusing math and graphs in this chapter, imagine something like supply and demand, right? So in general equilibrium theory, they're going to say that yes, supply and demand, they're going to, in reality, fluctuate around each other. But in the long run, viewed over time, the supply is going to tend to equal the demand, right? This is not the same thing as saying that supply and demand on average will be equal. Okay, so if there is a difference between what between equilibrium and average, and Kleiman says there is. Kleiman is here on the school of, when Marx says average, he really does mean average. He does not mean long-term tendency or equalization or anything, but the equilibrium theorists interpret Marx in such a way that when Marx says that the average rates of profit, that with the average rate and the general rate of profit, etc., they claim that what he means by average is the same thing as equilibrium theorists mean by long-term equilibrium. So it's a matter of interpretation, but Kleiman here is going to make the case for why Marx probably just means average, no more, no less, and why it matters.
So I was going to ask a question about this, and it's tangential but kind of important. He does cite some other people who agree with him, so this is not unique to Kleiman at all. But does anyone know what the standard reading of this was? When did people start trying to read Marx as an equilibrium theorist? Because it seems like it wouldn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense to. Also, given that pretty much nobody was when Marx was writing,
right.
So,
well, Rosian equilibrium wasn't even really like a thing.
Right.
I think it was post Sraffa, to be honest.
I understand this to be part of a sort of Western Marxist descent, that this is not like this Marxist-Leninist immortal science kind of reading.
Right. So I was just making sure, because I mean, for example, Kleiman quotes Joan Robinson in 1967 stating this as if it was like, duh, but just to remind you. I mean, the actual quote is, "There's no tendency of the long-term equilibrium, or the average rate of profit is not an equilibrium rate, or the supply price of capital. It is simply an average sharing the total surplus, which at any moment the capitalist system has succeeded in generating." And that seems like it would have been transparently obvious before the Schaeffer controversy.
Yeah,
or maybe just equilibrium theory being imposed on it in general, because the analytic Marxists do it too.
Yeah, if Marxists should take any post-Keynesian seriously, it's Joan Robinson. Over and over, everything I've seen quoted from her about Marx is she's not a Marxist, but she's clearly capable of reading him in a way that a lot of more known figures tend not to. I think that's probably because she's from a weirdo tendency.
Maybe she also just tends to state the obvious meaning of the text, which is weirdly refreshing, but
not everyone does it. I mean, economists, Derek.
Fair enough.
Okay. Do we want to do any more in depth in that, or shall we move on?
Let's move on. I think.
Yeah.
There's...
Okay. Do you want to just describe maybe what you mean as well by this little graph, or do you think that's more confusing than it's worth necessary?
I kind of think that graph might be useful.
Yeah, I like this graph.
Puya, do you want to have a go?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so Kleinman starts out by saying, okay, this is how average and equilibrium can diverge. He says that if an equilibrium rate is 25%, yet prices have a tendency to fall, the average rate of profit can diverge from this equilibrium rate quite a lot. And then he makes us a graph here that kind of illustrates his point. He shows that here the long run average is quite different from the static equilibrium. He says it's a 10% difference. Here we see an average of 22.5%, and you see it's a gravitational process instead of a static, just a steady state. And yeah, I think this graph really helps illustrate his point that average and equilibrium can diverge. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
Excellent. Okay, so let's move on here to part 6.2, which I think is the most important thing of this chapter, where we get into this idea of replacement cost. And this is going to get into the debates about whether Moseley's interpretation of how goods are revalued and how Andrew and the TSSI makes the claim that they are revalued. Okay, and the argument really gets into the difference between how do we value newly produced goods, which is kind of interesting. But okay, so let's have a look here. What have I got anything written down here? Sometimes I have things that Okay, does anybody want to take on this part? Who wants to take on this part? Derek, do you want to have a go? You're muted.
So, honestly, not really. I mean, I do agree with you that it's important, but yeah.
Okay, let me have a go and see how we get on. I think I'm going to let me see. Okay. Okay, so let's just read a bit of this because I think it's kind of some of it just needs to be read. So let's have a go and read this paragraph. The interpretation of Marx as a static equilibrium theorist discussed above is compatible with the idea that his theory permits input and output prices to differ when rates of profit are unequal. Okay, let me see. Sorry, I'm just trying to.
This is an interesting and important topic. This gets into the accounting stuff, like the accounting math.
Okay.
Where.
Okay. So let's. Sorry, 1 second. I just read this read.
Well, I guess I can go over the little example.
Yeah, the table is really helpful too.
Yeah,
let's go over this then.
Talk about it.
I'll go over that, and maybe Tom, you can read the first part while I talk about it.
Okay, yeah. So the textual support most commonly offered. Sorry. Okay, so I'm trying to see this on this interpretation.
But yeah, he pretty much starts out in this table, and he shows how the cost of apples being used as means of production can change over time. So he starts with an apple. He says yesterday this apple was produced at 2 p.m. Its value is 60 cents. And even though this apple's price changes through time, the value when it enters into production is 50 cents. So although that this value can change, it does not change the fact that the apple was paid for and went into production at a certain price, which is 50 cents. So we see that over time, this apple's price is changing. So if a capitalist goes out, they sell their apple. Oh no, let's start with the production. They produce their apple, its value is 60 cents. The apple is sold at 55 cents, and then it goes into production at 50 cents. When it comes out of production, it is worth 45 cents. Yeah.
So I
And,
think the paragraph. Okay.
Yeah. So this is just the same thing that we were saying in the Tom, you were saying in the last episode about the value transferred by constant capital, depending on its price at the moment in which it enters into production, and that we've also been saying actually from day one that the TSSI holds that it's the price at the point of production that matters, and not what your computer mainframe may be worth after you've produced whatever it is that you've produced, and you go to market and you see that, oh, if our machines would break down now, they cost this and this much to replace them, and then that somehow harkens back and decreases the value transferred back in time. So yeah, that's because that's really what the replacement cost interpretation implies, is that if I buy a computer today at $1,000, I use that to produce something. The next day, the same model of computer costs $800. The replacement cost people are going to say that the value of what you produced has now fallen because the price of the computer that you used to produce it has fallen after it's entered after it's been produced. So it sort of does a back in time kind of thing.
Yeah, so
which is its connection to simultaneism, is that the value can transfer backwards in time, which goes against the successivist and temporal nature of Marx's argument.
Okay,
Right.
so can I read this paragraph here? Sorry.
Tom, does anyone else hear Tom's audio breaking up?
yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Oh, shit. Okay, my audio, I'm hearing you guys all breaking up, so it's hard for me. Can you hear me at the moment?
Yeah.
Text.
Yeah, you're breaking up, but it's okay.
You're breaking up a lot.
Yeah.
Okay.
Might be something with your router.
My router is playing up today. Let me reset my router, and I'll be back in a minute. But can you see the bit that's highlighted here? If, for instance, can we read that chapter there? And can we read this paragraph here and the next paragraph down to here? I think just to make explicitly, because he says it quite well. So let's see if I can make it small enough. Yeah, that bit and the one below it as it goes on.
I'll read it.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah, I'll be back in a second.
If, for instance, an apple cost 50 cents at 1 p.m. today when it is used to make applesauce, but newly invested apples cost 45 cents each at 2 p.m. When the applesauce is completed, then the 45 cents is the post-production replacement cost of the 50-cent apple. Proponents of the replacement cost interpretation hold, therefore, that an apple transfers its value of 45 cents, not 50 cents, to the applesauce. It follows that the input and output of prices, or the input and output values relevant to Marx's theory of value determination, must be equal. For 45 cents if both the sum of value transferred to the applesauce from the point of input entered into the production at the process at 1 p.m. and the price or value of the new output harvested at 2 p.m. Skip. As we see, Marx also held the sum of value transferred from inputs to outputs were produced in the past can change actively by this, in quotation, by this theory, imagine the price of apples fall, causing the value of applesauce to fall from $3 a jar to 85 a jar. Since the value of previously produced commodity is determined by the value of the new commodity of that kind, a jar of applesauce that was worth $3 when it was produced is now worth $2.85. It follows then the apples used to produce that applesauce transfer 15 cents less value than it had when they transferred originally. None of this is in dispute, but none of it favors the replacement cost interpretation either. The controversy between the temporalist and replacement cost interpretations concerns the valuation of newly produced commodities only. An issue that none of the preceding points address is the preceding points all reduce all proposition to the value of previously produced commodities, and the sum of value transferred to them are therefore determined by the values of newly produced commodities. None of them pertain to how the value of these commodities produced is itself determined. Does the sum of value transfer from an input to a newly produced commodity depend on its input price when it enters production, as TSI holds, and when the cost of replacing the input when the new commodity is completed? Are the replacement cost as a replacement cost interpretation hold, passages that refer to the revaluation of previously produced commodities shed no light on this answer. The controversial issue is extremely narrow, for the reason it may appear trivial. After all, even if the value transferred from the input apple to applesauce is 50 cents at 1 p.m., now the replacement cost of 45 cents will be the sum of value transferred from apples to interproduction at 2 p.m. How can a minor delays and reevaluation possibly matter? The answer is the minor delays matter because they have a persistent and mounting effect. If your bathtub faucet leaks, the eventual difference between a fast and slow draining water is a difference between an empty tub and a flooded bathroom.
Yeah. So, so this is at the last episode, we spent a lot of time on the value transferred by the seed in that example, and I went on at some length about why it matters. This is exactly the reason that if the value of the machinery that you use is the same value as the one that enters into the production process, if you use the same V, that was the reason why our economy couldn't grow, is that we use the same V at the end of the process as we use at the beginning. And this is why the replacement cost interpretation simply must be false, because it directly leads to simultaneism. And the reason it does that is that it pretty much says that, value is determined retroactively in the production of new commodities, which would be very strange.
Hi, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, sorry.
I just wanted to.
I read that.
So I just want to respond. You didn't miss anything besides Derek reading what you wanted to read, and then Emmanuel just saying that. So I'm just going to respond to Emmanuel, or sort of obliquely respond. Basically, the point that I wanted to say is that, like, I had a lot of trouble with this when I was first reading the book, and the thing that really helped me was to try to get a grip on the concepts of historical cost, reproduction cost, and replacement cost, and like try to carve up exactly which one was which. Emmanuel, are these standard accounting terms?
Not well. They might have been at some point in time.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. They are. What I can say is that they're all sort of strange from current accounting laws. Because you can't really change the value of your assets at your whim, depending on which country you live in. However, the interpretation that's most in tune with what the law tends to fall on in correct accounting is the TSSI interpretation. Which is, I mean, the most accurate one that you're like the default one is the historical cost. So okay. you paid $1,000 for your for your, I don't know, no MacBook costs $1,000, but just go with it. All right, so that's what ends up in your balance sheet.
MacBook Air.
MacBook Air, yeah, and that the value of that, the amount of capital that is bound in that MacBook Air is going to decrease by the use of it, or the average lifespan of it, and decrease every year. So the historical cost is the default one. However, the sort of principles underlying it are more similar to the TSSI interpretation, but for most people, doing and calculating the way that the TSSI would be illegal, but that's just to keep people from artificially inflating or deflating their assets. I will say that it is in financial accounting, the TSSI is spot on. So because the increase or decrease in value happens before you sell your stock, for instance. So when it comes to financial assets, these are updated in real time, and whenever you exchange them for money or do something else with it, it's calculated at the point at which it's either exchanged or you do anything with it. So it's the value of your assets at the time of any sort of action that is usually done in accounting.
So yeah, I was thinking that too, because I used to work in accounts receivable way back before I became a teacher, and legal accounting, and I remember the laws governing that made it operate differently than when you were trying to figure out stock prices for your company. And the stock prices do remind me of the TSSI. I'm sorry, I'm pointing.
Yeah, because the TSSI is trying to get at what actually happens, right? Real estate is another area where you're legally allowed, or actually you're in Sweden at least legally enforced to do it the TSSI way.
Yeah, it's the same in the United States.
Yeah. The replacement cost thing is, it's what you do in insurance.
Which I used to work in, so this is not new. Like
Right.
this was, even though you guys asked me to say it, I have trouble explaining this, but this intuitively made sense to me because of my insurance background. So that's why you lose. That's why that's why as a consumer you tend to lose value when you get your insurance payout, because it's done at replacement cost, not historical cost. It's done at replacement cost modified by use.
And it's the reason that insurance companies do it by replacement cost and not by the standard method, and why they're allowed to do that is essentially to make sure that they can turn a profit. Less than they had to, because if they would have to pay out any other amount, basically, then they would be screwed.
But insurance is actually a very low profit margin business, which is something people don't really get.
Yeah, and the reevaluation back in time, which is what replacement cost does, is pretty much the only reason why they can operate even at such low margins.
Would insurance not also have to do with taking an account of oh my god, when you write off a value of an asset, what you call depreciation?
Mm-hmm.
It does take account of appreciation, but not fairly.
No, because depreciation should, by standard accounting practice, and this is again why I think if you know a bit of business economics or accounting, Marx makes so much more sense, because he's really just reiterating common accounting practice. But the general rule, the general principle is that the value depreciation is because it's exactly equal to the cost, i.e. how much of that constant capital, how much of that machinery you've used up within the accounting period, it should be directly proportional to how much value is transferred to the product. But you're also allowed it because that, if that were enforced in law, then nobody would be able to do accounting because, would you go about figuring out exactly how many dollars worth of MacBook Air you've used in your first year, right? So the other way that you're allowed to do it is you calculate the average lifespan of a machine of the same kind, and then you assume that you're going to use it constantly every year, which Marx also does, which is why he calls it constant capital. Generally in accounting, you would do that with historical cost, though the correct way to do it would be the TSSI way, but it's not allowed because if it were allowed, it would create havoc and people would be able to cheat very effectively on their taxes and stuff. But it's formally with regards to the principles the right way to do it. What was the cost of your MacBook Air? Not when you bought it. So if you buy your MacBook Air year one, you just let it sit on the shelf. You don't even open it. It's in mint condition. And year two, you start producing with it. All right. Formally, you should then revalue your MacBook Air to the price that it costs when it entered production. So you should have year two in your balance sheet. But that's
okay.
Yeah, that's not allowed in countries. Only liquidators can do that, basically. Usually.
Well, yeah, I like a bit of havoc myself.
I'm sorry.
But before we move on, have we stated what these three terms mean specifically, like just as a definition?
Okay.
We might have, and I might have missed it. I just want to make sure we do.
Historical cost is what it cost
at purchase.
At purchase, pre-production, reproduction.
At purchase, or at production.
At purchase.
At purchase.
Cost is purchase. Pre-production cost is at the moment it enters production, and post or replacement cost is the replacement cost is the cost of it now after production.
Yeah.
Okay. So
cool.
You bought it at the minute it entered production, and then the post-production or replacement cost. It's interesting, just with all you're talking about, you two guys there, Derek and Emmanuel, talking about the replacement cost stuff and accountants and stuff. I was just rewatching an episode today. A talk from the Left Forum, one of the MHI ones, and I had Kleiman, Freeman, and Michael Hudson on as well. And they were talking about how Marx was, in a letter to Engels, had said, that every time there's an argument between the economists and the statisticians are right 99% of the time. And I think, probably the accountants, I don't know if he means the accountants in that scenario, but I'd say he probably does. We move on to the next bit of the next chapter, next subchapter, where it's talking about the evidence. Are we good to go?
Yeah, pretty much. If I were Andrew, I would have put that quote in the beginning of my book and really played that up.
Well, yeah, it's a damn good quote. I don't have the exact one, but I'll have to check it up. Maybe I'll put it as a gift for this episode or something. Right. Okay, so now this stuff gets very wordy. Okay. Some of this stuff for me is very intricate, and I don't know.
You mean Capital?
Yeah.
The quotations from Capital.
Yeah. Well, this is actually the part where I felt a little bit more secure in, because it's philology.
But this stuff, like,
and also, like, can we talk about how this really should end fucking all debate? I mean, these quotes, man. I just. Especially the first one seems like a slam dunk example of why Kleiman is right.
Okay, why don't you take that first quote then, and I'll get it here.
All right. So the reason that this is confusing is because it talks about shillings and sixpences, which no one understands. But suppose that the price of cotton is one day 6 pence a pound, and the next day, as a result of the failure of the cotton crop, a shilling a pound. All right. So fuck that. Let's just say, suppose that the price of cotton is one day 1 cent a pound.
A shilling was 12 pence, an old pence. So it's 6 pence and then it's 12 pence.
12 and
Yeah. When I'm talking about Capital's word problems,
right?
So it doubles in price.
Yes. So one day it's 5 cents a pound, and the next day, because of a crop failure, again,
It's 10 cents a
previous
pound.
chapter of failing crops, it's double that. So 10 cents a pound. Each pound of the cotton bought at 10 cents, no, bought at 5 cents, and worked up after the rise in value, transfers to the product a value of 10 cents. And the cotton already spun before the rise and perhaps circulating in the market as yarn similarly transfers to the product twice its original value. Da 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 da. And and the next quote: if the price of a raw material rises, cotton, for example, cotton that has not yet been worked up but is still in the warehouse, rises just as much in value as cotton that is still in the course of manufacture, right? So you have, let's say you have two companies, both of them produce yarn. One has a religious holiday, so the cotton just sits in the warehouse. The other is some sort of, they're atheists or whatever, or they have no labor laws. So they keep producing yarn. And the price of the raw material, cotton, increases. Marx is saying that the cotton that is in the machine in company 2 has risen by the same amount as the cotton in the warehouse. And he continues, as the retrospective expression of more labor time, this cotton adds a higher value to the product, which it goes into as a component than it possessed originally, and the capitalist paid for it. Ta-da! There you go.
Yeah. Okay.
That's it. That's chapter 6, folks.
Well, but that repudiates historical cost valuation, but that's not really that's not the problem.
Yeah, let's read this little Lexi. You take this little bit there, Lexi.
Sure. These passages clearly repudiate historical cost valuation, but that is not in dispute. As discussed above, both the simultaneist interpretation and the TSSI deny that already existing stocks of commodities retain their original values after the change in the price of cotton. They both hold that the change in the cotton's price causes a revaluation of the already existing stocks. So that's
yeah, but that's the thing. The already existing stocks.
Yes.
Replacement cost says something about when the cotton is turned into yarn, and I'm sorry, I'm not gonna.
No. But Kleiman's basic point here is that you can't look at we're gonna rule out one of these things. He spelled out those 3 terms: historical cost, replacement cost, the other one I can't remember, and it's not gonna be historical cost.
Right.
That's what
pre-production cost.
It's pre-production cost, but it also spells out the reason why he cites these 2 passages in particular is that they're cited by simultaneous, or not simultaneous. They're cited by Mosley.
Reproduction costs. Yeah,
reproduction cost.
Right. Thank you.
And so I'll read the next one because it's actually kind of important. The TSA may at first seem incompatible with the end of the first passage, since Marx states that the value transferred from the cotton to the yarn rises retroactively after the cotton enters production. Yet the yarn was previously produced, spun before the rise in value. While the sole controversial question is how the value of newly produced commodities is determined, there actually is no compatibility. If anything, the two passages seem to support TSSI rather than the replacement cost interpretation. They seem to suggest that more value is transferred from cotton to yarn because the cotton is worth more when it was in production. It is worked up after the rise in value. In order to specify the amount of value the cotton transfers, Marx tells us that its price when it is worked up. The information that the replacement cost interpretation deems necessary, the cotton's price when it is completed, is never mentioned. That's what I think is actually the slam dunk.
Yeah, there you go. That's why I said, like, yeah, that's chapter 6, folks. Like, yeah, because this is why I can't make these quotes even make replacement costs, the replacement cost interpretation, really iffy, because the replacement, he doesn't speak about replacement cost. He says that, you know, the price of cotton in the spindle in Company 2 rises because there's a rise in value in cotton, and that rise is the same thing as the rise in of the cotton in the warehouse. Nowhere does he say that, you know, but when the yarn is completed, they take their stocks of the Company 2, the one that's producing, takes stock of their yarn, and they retroactively revalue it to the replacement cost. That he doesn't talk about replacement cost. He talks about changes in value when shit happens, when it enters into production, or when something else happens. He talks about this as, you know, everyone in finance accounting talks about stuff when it comes to stocks. You know.
Okay, we have an enormous quote here full of numbers. I find this, unless Derek, you want to take this, because this I just found absolutely torturous to get my head through this.
Yeah, same.
I think Derek's a man for the job.
But is it any good? Like, can we just discuss what he talks about here instead of actually reading it? Because it's so long and dense, and the points are kind of, you know, I just find you'd need like a few PowerPoint slides to get somebody listen to this to understand this. So
Yeah,
what do we want to do with this little bit?
In shorthand, Mosley cites a bunch of, I mean, he basically wrote through a bunch of citations from the economic manuscripts of 1861 to 1863, but trying to use them to uphold the replacement valuation. And TSSI explains all these passages and also doesn't require finding words that don't exist in those in those passages. The end. I mean, like, I could go through it, but it's basically arguing over wording in these specific passages that Mosley, that Kleiman is basically saying Mosley's kind of superimposing a reading on that's not there.
Yeah,
it's a justifiable reading, but it's not there.
Yeah, and also like, because I kept like reading and rereading these passages before I got to Kleiman's explanation of it. And it just seems to me that number 4 and 5 directly contradicts the replacement cost interpretation. Like, they would make no sense.
Let's read those.
Okay, let's read these. Let me highlight these bad boys here. They all like a bad boy. Yeah.
So he talks about, you know, prices fluctuating when commodities enter into production and are made into new commodities, and you know, this is an issue that we have to deal with. And then he says that this change in the value of the material and means of labor involves absolutely no alteration in the circumstance that in the labor process into which they enter as material and means, they are always pre-posited as given values. All right? He says they enter as given values. Prices fluctuate, but when they enter production, they're given. Okay, if it's given, when it enters production, then it can't be determined after production. There you go.
Yeah, I mean,
Values of a given magnitude.
And
In this process itself, they only emerge as values insofar as they entered as values.
yeah,
So they're given at the point of production, and then at the end of the production process, the value transferred is what was entered into the production process.
and the
There
only
you go.
reason this matters so much is because Mosley uses parts 2, 3, 6, and 7, and 10. Even though this is a quote, I believe, from Mosley, all the weird excerpts of that and being involved, to make his points, ignoring 4 and 5, like even though he quotes it. And that's the issue. This is and it's a textual argument, and I know that makes Tom's eyes glaze over. So, but it's one that says, look, if you look at it empirically, it's going to look like TSSI. If you look at what's actually written and actually read all of it carefully, it still looks like TSSI. Ipso facto, TSSI is more coherent. Therefore, the end.
Yep.
Yeah, I thought Andrew's arguments here were very convincing.
Okay. I think we should move on to the next bit, because I found actually the disconfirming evidence subchapter, I found this very convincing. Especially, I think it was the last time we were discussing it 2 weeks ago in the last episode, we were discussing how I had like a freak out when I was on holidays and I suddenly thought Mosley was right and the TSSI was wrong. And on that episode, I was saying, like, that Mosley is doing a good faith, misreading. But when I read again this chapter anew, for the first, during the last week or whatever, I read it again and had this stuff fresh in my mind. The evidence, the counter evidence is overwhelming when it comes to, say, the replacement cost versus the pre-production cost. I just find it. I don't know what I'm saying. Whether I'm saying that I roll back on my good faith argument, but what I would say is that I think the evidence is overwhelming in the TSSI's favor. So let's have a look. I've highlighted a couple of bits here. Let's have a look. I find this little bit pretty damning here. Okay, let's have a read this. At least from 1857. At least from the 1857 to 1858 Grundrisse onwards, Marx held that the production process results in the preservation of the amount of labor already objectified in used-up means of production, and thus preserves the previously existing value of capital. Like, that's it.
Boom.
That's it. So, like,
That's it.
if there is no change, like, that's just it. There's no getting around that for me. That's just it. And here, let's have a look at this next bit. Okay, let's just read all of this because it's only a short chapter. I've already read that first bit. The previously existing value of means of production reappear in the product. Subsequent works, including the chapter on constant capital and variable capital in Capital Volume 1, that develops this notion systematically, also refer quite frequently to the preservation and reappearance, and synonymously the transfer of the existing value. Such terminology is explicitly temporal. It suggests that a sum of value already in existence before production emerges from production unchanged. I do not see how this can be reconciled with the replacement cost interpretation. And I gotta agree. When we get to this, this idea of hermeneutics, I don't think there is any case to be made for the replacement cost. I just don't think there's just no logical, there's no reasonable way from reading the entirety of Capital that you can get to that idea. It just doesn't make sense.
Usually you don't. One of the things that's interesting is capital isn't what's cited for a lot of replacement costs. It's the economic manuscripts of 61 to 63. And again, Kleiman points out that even there, there's not a deviation. It's consistent with the Grundrisse and Capital too. So you're having to, it might be an honest misreading. I'm not accusing anyone of bad faith. I actually do think Mosley probably is acting in good faith, but he's good faith but motivated reasoning, because he's having to ignore a lot to come up with that conclusion.
Yeah.
Then good faith in one sense of the term, but not the other, not copying to the assumptions he's making.
Yeah. Or yeah. It's cherry picking, without, with good faith.
One thing that might be a deviation from the book a little bit, but I thought was interesting, is how this comes up in his other book, in The Failure of Capitalist Production, when he's talking about the historical costs and the current costs of the fixed assets, and how this is how this theoretical issue is like relevant to the looking at the empirical system, like in determining the rate of profit.
Yeah. Plus, like, honestly, any other interpretation than TSSI would go fundamentally against what any capitalist tries to do, or how they think, or so let's say, to quote Marx in I think it's the more Aveling translation, our friend Mr. Moneybags, right? And Kleiman deals with this in chapter 2 as well. Our friend Mr. Moneybags goes to the market. He starts a company for $1,000. He's going to buy wages. He's going to buy labor power, and he's going to buy constant capital. And let's say for some reason that he does the thing with the applesauce example, or the MacBook Air example, that say Mr. Moneybags buys $500 worth of equipment, but waits until the next year to enter them into production.
Whoa! I'm sorry, Emmanuel. We all got to mute our mics. There's just like slamming and shit in the background. Could you repeat that, Emmanuel? You're muted.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's actually coming from my side. So, shit. I'm gonna have to get the gain.
Sorry, just start it over.
Yeah. All right. I'm gonna lower the gain a little bit. Like so. Is it less noisy now?
Emmanuel, this is terrible, sloppy unprofessionalism. What's going on?
I'm sorry.
We'll cut it all.
I'm going to have to kick him off this
No, that's not what I meant.
Unacceptable behavior.
Stop it, Tom.
So, yeah, I mean, my only question to that, Emmanuel, is assuming this is TSSI, and I've always had this question for the insistence that the only way to read this, it would make sense of the way capitalists think, is TSSI. Are you saying then that most Marxist economists held to a version of TSSI that was simply unstated before the 50s? Because like for example, we've talked about this. I don't think like Ernest Mandel actually disagrees with Kleiman that much on anything.
No, they co-edited a book, right?
Right.
Or was that Freeman?
That's Freeman.
Okay, thank you.
So like, is it just that these assumptions were so ingrained that they didn't have to systematize it?
I think, Derek, that it's this kind of idea of the, academic Marxian, post-Keynesian types do it this way. And all the kind of radical Marxist economists would have read Marx the normal way that we would think the TSI works.
Right. So they wouldn't have to state the TSI because it would just been common sense.
Common sense.
Yeah, I mean...
And it didn't exist
because it is common sense. If you try to interpret Marx as an economist, particularly as an economist of his time and time period, and particularly as an economist who learned by by studying the great classics and the actually existing economic theory of the time and the actually existing economic theory period, yes, the TSSI is just common sense, but I think a lot of this really stems from, people trying to make people who either aren't economists or they're macro economists and don't have any grasp on like business economics and things like that, which is a lot of the time what Marx was using. So, but again, like what I think you have a point there, Derek, because one of my greatest contentions is I really don't think it's possible to read Marx in much of a different way.
Not in it makes
Because
sense.
he puts such an emphasis on the capital invested and whether or not capitalists get value from their investment. So if, you know, a MacBook Air is worth $1,000 at year one, but you don't start producing until year two and you wait 365 days, most capitalists will think that's a loss.
Yeah, I mean, it was weird.
So how, you know, most capitalists want to start as soon as they purchase the equipment. Why would they want to do that if what mattered was the replacement cost? It just makes no sense. They want to start producing before everyone else buys the same machinery, and and the price of that machinery goes down. They want to be first. They want to be first on the ball. That's capitalism. And in order to make that work, you have to do the TSSI interpretation. And this is why Marx, states that it's the value transferred because constant capital is dead labor. And he always talks about it in the sense that it starts transferring its value at the point of where you actually use it. I just
I think it's worth noting.
I
think that it's worth noting as well. Like I think I said this before, but really, it's worth noting that this idea, this way of looking at it, didn't exist behind the Iron Curtain. It's a Western Marxist tradition,
right? Well, and also it doesn't exist amongst it. It doesn't exist amongst Trotskyists before the '60s either. Like that's why I keep on mentioning Mandel, because I'm picking from a tradition that's not part of the MHI tradition.
The Iron Curtain didn't exist when Marx wrote Capital or the economic manuscripts.
But also like Austrian economics didn't exist and Keynesian economics didn't exist, and like.
Yeah,
I mean, sure, but like if we're interested in Marx's actual theory, then yeah.
No, I mean, I get it, but what I'm saying, like the errors of Stalinism are not these errors. They're not the errors that are coming up against the TSSI. But my point about this is just like when you say the TSSI is the only way of reading it, I want to emphasize that if we are saying that, we must say that the common sense interpretation of Marxists before the 50s. Before the Marx Keynes hybrid thought, and using that to try to get around the Austrian Marx debates, seems to me to say that this was just a common sense reading, and of course they didn't have to call it the TSSI or the single system because everybody just read it this way because it was common sense from the way they understood basic economics to work, and they weren't dealing with these later macro theories that changed some fundamental assumptions. In a way that doesn't match with actual business practices. I mean, I read Debunking Economics by Stephen Keen, and until I got to the last chapter where he starts shitting on Marx, I actually thought he was proving a lot of Marx's points by pointing out that businesses don't run the way macroeconomics or even the way a lot of microeconomics based on those assumptions describes. They just don't. Anyone's ever worked in accounting would know that. So.
Yeah, and that greater point about economic theory being so far from capitalist practice, that's what makes some of the stronger claims you're making, Emmanuel, not something I'm going to jump on when you say the TSSI is the only way to make sense of this. It sounds, dogmatic or something, but what Derek is saying, I think adds the necessary context that there was a previous interpretation that makes more sense, that wasn't as ad hoc and distorted. And when you make an argument like that, I think a lot of people's knee-jerk reaction, especially if you're an erudite academic, is to say that you're being an antiquarian orthodox, zealot. If you're trying to bring up an old interpretation and say that it's superior to a new interpretation, this is the Whiggish.
Right. No. So
Whiggish
just to clarify, like I'm not saying that the it's only the TSSI. Like when I say the TSSI, what I mean, what I assume that the listener hears is that I think that TSSI is Marx's theory, and so it's not that it's a dogmatic thing with Kleiman in particular. It's just that to me, it's obvious when you read Marx and what he's trying to get at. That Andrew is on the right track with regards to Marx's original writing. So it's not that the TSSI is the only answer because it's the only answer and therefore dogmatic. It's just that given what Marx was trying to do in his entire project and the economics available at the time, it seems to me that most other interpretations, just like you said, Derek, are doing an after the fact counter overimposing of their own sort of modern understanding onto a theory that really doesn't deal with any of those sort of things.
I'm also going to say that the TSSI would not necessarily lead you to all the political or economic positions that Kleiman holds. I'm going to say that too. So, like, even though I think this is a great, my theory is that TSSI systematizes a sort of way that people just naturally read this, not just in Russia but in general, until the 50s and 60s, and those debates have made it where we need to state things that would have never needed to be stated before, because we didn't have to talk about a temporal system. People just knew how accounting worked. And that's interesting to me. I also like to point out that if you actually look how economic planners work, they use a weird, like in China, for example, they use a weird ad hoc of like general accounting practices and a little bit of marginal utility theory, but not a lot. So it doesn't resemble anything. It doesn't resemble what a lot of these like later Marxists are describing at all. So my just point there is like it's to back you up, but it's to say like the reason why we have to say this in terms of TSSI is we're systematizing something because of context now that would have just not been there in the past, wouldn't have been necessary in the first place.
So what we're essentially saying is that we're all Vatican I. Derek, are you Vatican I?
I'm Council of Trent, mofo.
Council of Trent, motherfucker. That means you're a Ricardian. Off. Come on, get rid of this motherfucker. Now, I know that Emmanuel won't be. He won't be because he comes from Lutheranville, as we all understand. Sweden is just some kind of atheist Lutheran. I don't know, hellhole, commie, hellhole.
Commie. Good old commie in Sweden. Yep.
Good old commie Sweden. Let's just to finish this off. Let's read another one of these, but just to hammer the case home, I'll read this one. Okay. Many passages in the economic manuscript of 1861 to 63, almost all of them from the early books 1 through 7, state explicitly that the amount of value transferred depends upon inputs pre-production value. The value of the material and means of labor only reappears in the product because the material and means of labor possesses this value before the labor process and independently of it. That's with emphasis is in the original, which is important. Raw materials and means of labor add to the labor time contained in the product only as much labor time as they themselves contained before the production process. The using up of an input in production increases the commodity's value to the amount of its own value. Marx further specifies this means, to be precise, the value it has when it enters the process of production. A means of production does not add more value to the product than it possessed before production. As value, this part of capital therefore enters unchanged into the production process and emerges from it unchanged. Like, it's just like, it's just impossible to deny the clarity of and the veracity of the TSSI one. It's nearly, it's like watching a strawweight fighting a heavyweight. It's just getting plastered around the place. In boxing they got weight classes for reasons. In hermeneutics, you can't just pick one tiny bit of text. You got to take the whole goddamn thing.
Yeah, I felt like that quote needed like air horns after it, like beep 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 beep. It was just like slam dunk.
That can be arranged, Puya.
Yeah.
World star.
That'd been hilarious.
Okay, well, we've kind of really thrashed that. Let's go on to the next bit of a chapter here. We have a table. I know these tables, I don't know how much point there is in talking through this table. This is a reconstruction of a table where Marx was having an argument with some dude called Ramsey about the profit rate. And this has been recreated by Andrew from these texts. And it, in essence, just shows what we already kind of know. I don't know if there's too much point in going on through this. Does anybody want to go into it? Because it'll be very, very obtuse to a listener. Especially,
I would say no, because I already feel like we're repeating ourselves a whole lot in this chapter, and this is going to get super repetitive and about an obscure dispute. Does anyone disagree with me?
I don't disagree, but I want to just make sure Emmanuel has nothing to say just because it's a table, and I know how he loves tables.
Yeah.
I also like this table as well.
Well,
Maybe
he is
over the table.
All right.
He is Swedish, and they, IKEA, their tables and chairs are famous throughout the world.
It's true.
Emmanuel is eating chorizo. He won't be ready for a while. Chorizo is too chewy for Emmanuel to make a quickie reply there. Well, Puya, do you like this table? Why do you like this table so much? Give it to us.
Well, I think it just summarizes the whole point pretty well, and it's an example that Marx gives that pretty much repudiates a whole case that value is determined by the physical quantity, and that instead it's determined by labor time. And because if you look at the table, he says, okay, so the capitalist advances $120 to start the circuit of capital. He goes to the market and he purchases commodities, corn, other constant capital to the value of 80, and variable capital to the value of 40. And he says, okay, so there's in both these years, there's the same amount of labor, but in 1 year, the output doubles. And he shows that, okay, so he accounts for all these values in terms of physical quantities in the first row. And you see that although in the second row, the output has increased twice the amount, Marx himself considers this to be an equivalent amount of value because there's an equivalent amount of labor. And I think this is just a really clear, concise way to summarize the whole point. And I don't know if you guys have anything to say about it.
As long as I don't have to say anything about the controversy that generated it, I think we're fine. Does Emmanuel have anything left to say about the Ramsey Marx debate and or this wonderful, beautiful IKEA-like simplicity of the table?
Nope, nothing to add. The one thing is I'm not exactly sure why Andrew adds some of the stuff to the table that he does, because it's clear from no, I have nothing to add.
Okay,
let's move on.
Let's move on. Okay, now I think we should move on to the chapter where it's about one system or two, the idea of whether it was a dual system or not. Now, I think this is our last subchapter, so we're really milling through this well today.
Believe it or not.
Woo! Yeah. Which I didn't think. I thought this episode would take a lot longer. So
Me too, but we're saving our ruthless criticism for the end.
Yeah, I'm just saving it for Derek. Now, sorry, Derek. The one system or two, who wants to take this one off? Lexi, you're really, really, really good at this. Why don't you give it a go?
Well, thank you. Let's see. Okay, so this is the part of the book that I think is a little more complicated, and whereas I think temporal and simultaneous, like that distinction obviously makes sense, this is where Andrew is going to be like drawing his argument that this is where Marx is coming from, and trying to reconstruct Marx's value theory. We need to start with a conceptual distinction, this time between the value of means of production and subsistence versus the value advanced as constant and variable capital. Then Andrew throws a quote at us. The capital advance is made up of two components. One, the sum of money laid out on means of production, and the other, the sum of money expended on labor power. So that's a pretty classic breakdown between value advanced for capital and for labor power. And let's see. Yeah. So in other words, the capital value advance is the sum of money paid for inputs, and its magnitude therefore depends on the inputs' prices, not their values.
Yeah, like what's important here, I think, is that it's money,
Yeah.
Capitalists don't give a damn about, socially nested labor time or anything. They're interested in the money. They pay money for their goods. They don't care what the value is in the stuff they buy, and they pay money for the labor power. So sorry.
No, it's okay. This distinction makes sense of otherwise inexplicable passages in Capital, such as it is particularly apparent that in the case of agriculture, how the same causes that raise or lower the price of the product also raise or lower the value of the capital, since this consists to a large extent of that product itself. The implication... Okay, yeah. The implication, according to Andrew, is that when Marx says things like the value of the constant capital is transferred to the product and merely reappears in it, he takes this as like an obvious support for the single system interpretation, even though value of the constant capital contains the word value. He doesn't have a problem with this because these things at the end of the day are the same thing. And so prices are assumed to be equal values. The difference between the value of the inputs and the value of capital advance is not really discussed until chapter 9 of volume 3. But he goes over some passages that he thinks indicates some of this beforehand. And some of those were quoted in, what the fuck is 4.2 here? I don't know. That was quoted before. And let's see. Okay. I guess we should read this one that he brings in. That I think Sweezy and Borkovich point to this as being their justification for Marx being a dual system theorist. This is, I suppose, in Capital. So I'm going to read Andrew's first. So traditionally, the notion that Marx was, or at least wanted to be, a dual system theorist was based on Borkovich's claim that in chapter 9 of Capital, volume 3, Marx recognized that his account of the value price transformation contained an error. Sweezy seconded this claim in 1942, citing the following passage as evidence that Marx was aware of his error. It was originally assumed that the cost price of a commodity equaled the value of the commodities consumed in its production. But just as the price of production of a commodity can diverge from its value, so can the cost price of a commodity, in which the price of production of other commodities is involved. It is necessary to bear in mind this modified significance of the cost price, and therefore to bear in mind too that if the cost price of a commodity is equated with the value of the means of production used up in producing it, it is always possible to go wrong. And Andrew's response is, the reason why Marxist critics construe this passage as an admission of error is that they fail to distinguish between the value of means of production and the sum of value advanced as capital. In the absence of that distinction, he seems to be admitting that there's a difference between the value of capital and the price of capital, a difference that leads directly to two separate value and price systems. Yet once we distinguish between the value of inputs and the value of capital, it becomes apparent that the main function of the passage is to make that very distinction. Rather than admitting error, Marx is anticipating that readers might go wrong if they overlook this distinction, as they have now for almost a full century.
So does anybody want to expound on that difference there? I found this part of the text quite unclear, I must admit. I don't know if I got what he was arguing here.
One thing I'd say is emphasis in original. You know, this is not Kleiman doing some sort of shenanigans where he's conveniently putting some things in bold. The emphasis is in original.
Okay, can you explain to me what the difference is between the value of the value of means of production and the sum of advance at capital? So is he saying that?
Yeah.
Like, what's that distinction there that he's saying? Footnote 11.
Yeah. So what's at stake here is how is the value of constant capital determined? We dealt with that with simultaneism. Now we have to deal with that in the dual system interpretation as well, because it shows up here again, and it's super important, and it's super important to making the theory work or not. And there has been a debate of whether or not Marx is implying, or Marx himself means, that the value transferred by constant capital to the product depends on the value of the constant capital or on the price actually paid for it. And this is one of the things where the TSSI is going to say that, you know, it's a single system. The value transferred is related to what the capitalist paid for it when it enters production. But the dual system interpretation wants to have two different systems, etc. And Kleiman uses this quote to explain why the TSSI interprets this the way it does. And this is why my point of emphasis in original is why I made that point. So, you know, it was originally assumed that the cost price of a commodity equaled the value of the commodities consumed in its production. This is Marx talking about Capital Volume 1, where he assumes that prices equals values, right? But just as the price of a production of a commodity can diverge from its value, so can the cost price of a commodity, in which the price of production of other commodities is involved. And then he says, you know, you need to keep this in mind, that if the cost price of a commodity is equated with the value of the means of production used up in producing it, it is always possible to go wrong. So it seems to me, reading this passage, that Marx is saying, hey, if you make the mistake of equating the cost price of a commodity with the value of the means of production used up in producing it, you're going to get me wrong, right? And you're not going to really understand what's going on. And, you know, I'm sorry for not making this clear in Capital Volume 1, where prices equaled values and there was really nothing to debate. So it seems to me here that Marx is not admitting an error. He's not acknowledging any sort of inconsistency. He's just giving us a manual of how to interpret him properly, or giving us instructions on how not to misinterpret him. And this is what Kleiman calls attention to, but the dual system interpreters see this in a different light.
I was about to say, Kleiman picks this passage specifically because Sweezy and Buzzword picked it.
Right. Yeah.
Right. He's not picking it out because it's because it makes the point strongly. It is literally the passage that Sweezy and
Borkovich,
which actually thought proved their point. And it's based on the dangling clause at the end, I think, is why they said it's a dual system theory. But I'm going to be honest with you, having read this, even with the emphasis in original, I get the point here about it not being a mistake. I do not necessarily understand what the dual system claim is about it.
Yeah, let's continue to try to explicate, because I'm withholding some criticism as well.
All right, cool.
It sounded like that's what you're about to do, Emmanuel.
Oh yeah. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So like the dual system claim boils down to that if values and prices diverge, and the value transferred by constant capital equals the value is
to be the value
of the constant capital. So never mind what the capitalist actually pays for, right? Never mind what it actually sells for at the point of production, right? This is what we talked about back in chapter 2 about the price and value distinction and dual system versus single system. So the dual system interpretation holds that the value transferred by the means of production does not depend in any way upon the price, whether or not it's revalued or whatever, but it does not depend on the price. It depends on the value of the constant capital. And the TSSI is going to say no. It depends on the price because the capitalist bought the machinery and buys the wages for money. Those have to be reimbursed for in order to make a profit, etc. This is why values and prices converge. But if you have value entering production, value being transferred by value, and new value added, then you're dealing with value, and that's why you end up with a transformation problem, is that you then have to ask yourself, if value is the only thing involved at all times, how on earth could values then transform into prices? And the TSSI is saying that no, they don't. They're always part of the same process. And this is why this Marx quote is important in order to sort of prove the TSSI, the TSSI point, as it were. That Marx is actually saying that it's the, let's see. It is necessary to bear in mind this modified significance of the cost price.
Yeah. And footnote 11 is about the cost price.
Yeah.
Just
yes.
What does it say?
The
cost price. Recall that a commodity's cost price equals the sum of value transferred, the constant capital portion of its value, plus variable capital.
Yep.
So on the next page? After that quote, I think it's on 107. I mean, at risk of reading to death, I also have a problem with this distinction. So I feel like this. All right, so I'm gonna read fucking half a page here. It's ridiculous, but I don't know how else to really get this. Try to break down what he thinks here and what he thinks Marx thinks. So, passage in the 1861-63 manuscript also discusses how commodities values are determined when inputs are bought at their prices of production rather than their values. the difference between price of production and value is incorporated into the value of the new commodity as a presupposed element. In other words, the constant capital component of the commodity's value is no longer equal to the value of the inputs, but to their value plus the price value difference. And since value plus price minus value equals price, this suggests that the sum of value transferred depends upon the input's prices. So just to appreciate that before moving on, this is how, like, that's the basic mechanism of how price is transferred into value. And moving on, prior to chapter 9 of value 3, where he relaxed his assumption that prices equal values, Marx frequently stated that the variable capital, the value of labor power, and workers' necessary labor are determined by the value of the means of subsistence needed to reproduce their labor power. This seems to support the dual system interpretation. We have already seen, however, that Marx actually defined variable capital more precisely as the amount of money spent to hire workers. Moreover, once he relaxed the assumption that prices equal values, Marx pointed out that it is really the price of means of subsistence that determines the value of labor power and necessary labor. Quote, the average price of labor, i.e., the value of labor power, is determined by the production price of the necessary means of subsistence. End quote. Thus, if workers consume, quote, commodities whose prices of production are different from their values, they must work for a greater or lesser amount of time in order to buy back those commodities to replace them, and must therefore perform more or less necessary labor. End quote. Monopoly prices also have an effect. Okay, I'm going to skip the part about, oh, you know what? I can't. Okay. Monopoly prices also have an effect. Quote, if the commodity with the monopoly price is part of the worker's necessary consumption, it increases wages and thereby reduces surplus value, as long as the workers continue to receive the value of their labor power. As the last sentence indicates, these passages are also incompatible with the dual system interpretation of, quote, surplus value. What follows from all of this is that commodities have a single cost price. There is no separate cost price that depends on the values of means of production and subsistence. Indeed, Marx seems invariably to have referred to the cost price, never to two separate cost prices. So without reading the literal entire page, I feel like that's as good as I think this is as good as this book does at explaining what the hang-up is here with dual and single system, and at least getting at what he believes Marx to be doing, and why he believes that even after, chapter 9 of volume 3, that we're still in a system where values and prices are, become commensurate through this process. And that's Marx's math, apparently. So explication. It's my best shot.
Well read. You're a very good reader. Joke. Yeah, I still don't understand what the difference. I still, I get all those arguments, but I don't understand what the value of means of production, like, what's the difference between them two? Somebody tell me.
The difference between what and what?
It's highlighted there. Have a look.
Yeah, they fail to distinguish between the value of means of production and the sum of value advanced as capital.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the sum of value advanced as capital is what you paid, what Mr. Moneybags invests. Right?
Yeah.
And that may not necessarily be the same thing as the value of the means of production.
Why?
Because, are
you saying just because the thing sells below its value? This is what we're trying to say.
Yeah, that's one thing. But there is also more. There's also more to the sum of value advanced as capital than just the value of means of production.
Puya, what were you going to say?
I was gonna say that okay, so the value advanced as capital. That's the amount of money you paid for it. The value of the means of production might be different than the amount of money you paid for it because there's prices of production.
But what does
Okay.
that have to do with the dual versus single system difference? That's what.
No, but
That's
why?
where I'm bogged down.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's in that next sentence. So, in the absence of that distinction, he seems to be admitting that there is a difference between the value of capital and the price of capital, a difference that leads directly to two separate value and price systems.
So imagine like, okay, so I paid a certain amount of money for a calculator, but the value of a calculator is different than the price I paid for it. That means that okay, so imagine then I use a calculator in production to produce something. The TSSI I believe is saying that it transfers the amount of money that you paid for it, while the dual system interpretation states that it transfers the amount of value that it contains, which is
No,
different from the amount of money that you paid for it, or the capital
no,
advance, the value of the capital advance.
I think
so
the TSSI not saying it's going to transfer the price of that one, not necessarily the price that you paid for it, but the real price of it. Because if I stole this gets back to my point we made way back when I said, could you not just steal the calculator? Like, if you steal the calculator, the price of the calculator would still not be zero. It would be the price you should have had to pay for the calculator. So
that's right. That's
Wait.
exactly right. But the point
before we get into a stealing, let me. So like,
okay. So let's take something that we all know has no value, but that we all know has a price. All right. Let's take something like software. Right. So you work in Adobe Premiere, and you make movies. All right. So the commodity movie is produced by constant capital C and the new value added N. And that is the value of the commodity that you produce, i.e. the film. However, does this make sense if we assume that the value transferred by Adobe Premiere is related to the value of it, i.e. zero? Is that how the economy works? Or is it rather the case that whether or not I pirated it, you know, it may have zero value, but it still has a price that people pay, and that price plus the new value added, the price over time. So say a version of Adobe Premiere lasts for, I don't know, 5 years or something. That price is later later turns up in the price tag of the commodity.
But
it
he's
seems
not
to me
saying
that the
here.
latter is the case.
But like Andrew is explicitly like why I'm confused is like, because would he not say like value of means of production and price, sum of money advances capital? Because that's what you're kind of saying there, isn't it?
No, again, this harkens back to some of our very first episodes where we spend a lot of time on this point that Mr. Moneybags spends money in order to make money. And wages are bought for money, and constant capital is bought for money. And as soon as you want to make a watertight, like, assuming that assuming that the commodities produced by Mr. Moneybags' company does not in any way depend on the prices that he paid to hire workers and constant capital, machinery, etc. That assumption that it has nothing to do with the actual capital outlay. That is the dual system interpretation, right? So the dual system interpretation, because it treats values and prices like two super distinct, separate entities that have nothing to do with each other, right? Mr. Moneybags can invest in $1,000 worth of equipment and $1,000 worth of wages, and yet, if that does not have any bearing on the actual surplus value produced or the value of the commodities produced, and therefore not even on the rate of profit. Does that make it clearer that why this is an important issue? Because Marx always talks about capital expenditure. He talks about returns on investment. He speaks about this in terms that while prices and values are different, they're not. There's not a watertight separation between them, and indeed they're co-determined, as it were. And therefore they belong to the same system of determination.
That makes sense to me, but I have to be honest with you, Emmanuel, that those points have to be explicated from other chapters, are from us talking to it in a way that makes at least the phrasing of it here opaque.
True.
Yeah, I also think this part is pretty opaque.
To me,
Pretty
like
difficult
the
to read.
dual system versus single system thing is sort of the weaker point. I get the temporal versus simultaneous thing, that is slam dunk. The dual versus single system is a little bit more. That's a little bit more opaque. Just as you said, the reason why I think that the single system interpretation is the correct one is because of what we said in, I believe it was chapter 2 or chapter 3, when we talked about dual, or when Andrew talked about dual versus single system interpretations, and we had the table 2.2 that explained how even though the value and the price rate of profit are the same, prices and values will necessarily diverge.
Okay.
Right. But that's where things get, I think that's why it's confusing, because we're hung up on, I think it's, the point is harder to, it's a weaker point for a reason. The reason why it's a weaker point is what you're not saying is prices and values have a one-to-one connection. So when we say single system, what we're saying is there is a systemic relationship that is singular, but not that they are the same thing, which is, for some reason, it seemed clear to me in chapters 2 and 3, but here I was, reading back through this, I was like, I'm now confused when I didn't feel like I was before. And I don't think I'm the only person who felt that way. So
can I read it?
You highlighted a very important thing here.
Yeah, this
really drives this point home, why dual systems, why it just cannot be dual systems according to Marx.
Okay, let me read this bit then, because when I read this book, I had difficulty understanding what the point was there. I could not really get it. But when I just turned the page there, I just highlighted and it said this answered my question. So let's see if it'll clear my head up, because I found that what we've discussed so far in this very confusing, to be honest. Not confusing, I just don't. It's like it's unclear what his point he's trying to make. Yeah. Here we go. This is from Marx. The cost price of a commodity simply depends on the quantity of paid labor it contains, while the value depends on the quantity of labor it contains, whether paid or unpaid.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. So the cost price can differ from the value. Yeah. So that's just, like I think we should, if we want, maybe we'll read this bit again, maybe over the week, and maybe we'll, because I think we're just going to waffle, a lot of us. But I think maybe
Yeah,
ourselves, we can clear our heads up a bit with it.
Yeah, and also like the very next paragraph that starts with
Okay.
an alternative single system reading eliminates the difficulty. That one.
Okay, let me read this.
It's also kind of helpful to understand what the hell this is about.
Okay. An alternative single system reading eliminates the difficulty. To reproduce a commodity, living labor and means of production are needed. What then is the amount of labor needed to reproduce the commodity? Answer: the living labor plus the amount of labor that is needed to acquire the necessary means of production. The latter amount of labor is the amount represented by the money capital that purchases these means of production. If, for instance, a means of production costs $1,000 and $50,000 is the $1,000 and $50 is the monetary expression of 1 hour of labor, i.e., the melt, the monetary expression of labor time, is $50 per labor hour. Then the amount of labor needed to. Sorry, I'm getting some interference there. I'm going to mute Puya. There we go. The amount. Let me just read that last sentence again. If, for instance, a means of production costs $1,000 and $50 is the monetary expression of 1 hour of labor, then the amount of labor needed to acquire the means of production is 20 hours of labor. Okay. Okay, so I think this is just, he's showing how you can switch between measuring the single system in terms of labor hours and in terms of dollars.
Yeah, and it also shows that the amount of labor that is needed to acquire something. So the amount of labor that is needed to acquire the necessary means of production is represented by the money capital that purchases these means of production. So labor necessary to acquire something, that's where you have your price come into the whole determination of everything. So yeah, that's why prices and values are always intertwined, intermingled. They're different things, but they're not two trains running on two separate tracks. It's one and the same train.
Okay, look, I think we've done that. Well, I think we've said enough about that stuff. Does anybody have anything they want to say, Derek or Puya? Do we think we've confused ourselves enough? Have we clarified things enough? Is there any notes on this final section?
No. Did you follow that, Tom?
Did I follow what?
Like the difference between dual and single system?
Like, I know I have it clear in my head, but I just have a specific difficulty understanding what that, like, you know, start quote from Marx is and the relevance of it, if you know what I mean. I understand the argument, but I just don't understand. I understand the general argument. It's in my head, but I have difficulty when I zone in on that paragraph and what he's saying and specifically the relevance of it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Marx can be kind of hard to read.
Yeah, I just think it's, for me, it's like you know, if they were writing the equations on the board, it'd be simple, but it's like it's having to parse. I find the problem, but you know, because I only skimmed this before we started, so you know, if I read it and I read it again and I put my brain to it, it'll probably just pop like it did before. So I don't want to ruin everybody else's experience of it. Derek, what do you make of it all?
Oh, I mean,
Oh yeah.
Derek was reading Facebook. I can tell it by the look in his face. Am I right?
No, but I was reading something else because
I told you.
So
There's porn.
no, not for that look on my face. So this is
Come on, Derek, get it together. Jesus Christ.
Should I read it?
Yeah,
No,
you don't have to read anything. You don't have to read it. I'm not asking you to read anything. I'm just asking people's opinion.
Well, the thing is, I'm still. I mean, like, I think this is obvious when when we are talking about this particular paragraph, but it's still not entirely clear, and except in those in those prior tables, what the relationship actually concretely is to me. Because the melt, it's the monetary expression of labor time. How do I say this? Is not. I don't know. This to me is something that actually has to be. It's not automatically apparent to me when I read Capital. Like, so yeah. I mean, it seems to me when everyone's like, this is the weaker point, it also seems like this is the more important point because you're arguing against the Austrians.
Yeah, it strikes me that the reason that people ever resorted to simultaneous valuation probably has something to do with this. Like, that sounds nuts considering the havoc that simultaneous valuation, wreaks on Marx's theory. But like, the only thing I can think of is that there was a problem that people were really frustrated by, that they're trying to get around with newfangled tools and accidentally made the opposite claims from the thinker they were working from. Like, that's a story I have, that's one story that makes sense of all the nonsense here. Right. Like, but not I mean, not really, but then everyone would be logically inconsistent anyway, but whatever.
That's a charitable reading.
I'm doing what I can.
Yeah. Okay, well,
Mother Teresa over here.
That's true. With the long flowing locks. Now.
Yeah. I mean, but to me, it's still hard to talk about when we talk about the single system, right? It is hard to talk about what that single system is. The dual system creates all kinds of problems. But what the dual system satisfies, seemingly, is the fact that there's not a one-to-one relationship between price and value. The single system as articulated here also satisfies that, differently from some other single systems, because it's not this is not the only articulation of a single system. There are people who have a labor theory of price. So, which seems to me like you don't like the reason why you don't want a labor theory of price is because it's kind of transparently wrong. Like, you can easily disprove it.
Yeah. Sheikh, he is not a single system guy, though, as far as I'm aware. He was an actual dual system. He tried to.
I think he changed, though, in the book. I think he went from.
It's complicated. He developed an iterative solution that I think starts dual system-y and ends single system-y.
I remember earlier in their book, it stated that he started off as. I forgot what he started off as. It might have been a dual system or a simultaneist, but he changed his position. And I think he's a single system theorist, but not in the way Kleiman is. I like single system in the way that Derek was saying, as in there's no prices of production. There's only labor prices. There's no values. Or there is only values.
Okay. Well,
that's what I mean. Sorry.
Okay. Sorry. I think we've kind of gone through it for today. Is there anything, do people want to talk about their overall feelings on this chapter? I know we've essentially been unclear and waffly on the last section on the dual system. I think we might revisit it. Maybe if we can all give it a detailed reread. I feel like I would benefit from it, and I feel like what we've discussed here, when I put it out into the edited podcast version, it'll be very waffly. I feel like we should clarify our own thoughts on it for the start of the next episode. What do people think about that?
Sounds good.
Yeah, that'd be good. I mean, I think we should engage with the chat after we're done with the main stuff, just because this is the subject of the chat. It's interesting. But yeah, I mean, like, I think that there's actually just an intrinsic vagueness and difficulty in the source material. We could take some more time, take another look at this. I wouldn't be opposed to that, but I imagine that without consulting a lot of sources outside the book, we're not going to be able to get like the kind of grasp that we want.
Sure. Yeah, I agree. It's not extremely clear what there's no detailed examples on how these differ.
Okay. Right. So do we want to delve into the chat? I know there's been lots of action from the same people as normal in here. We have, let's give some people a shout out. There's Tom O'Brien again, the handsome devil in there. Erica Whelan, Cancel Com, Lexi Katsopoulos. Where did you get Katsopoulos from? Is that like cats?
Jesse Katsopoulos from Full House.
Who's that?
It's a sitcom character from the 90s.
Jesse Katsopoulos. Let me have a look here now. Oh my god, how random is this? Full House. What the hell is Full House?
Right, you never seen Full House, Tom?
I was in San Francisco. So. I was in San Francisco at the time. That show is set in San Francisco, and there was just a sort of like spectacular like fakeness to my experience there that I felt was summed up by Full House.
Yeah, is that like what is that? Like 12 people in the family or something? I'm looking at a picture here.
It's a show about like I think a widower and his kids and like the sort of ragtag group of like uncles and guy friends that raise all these girls in San Francisco. It's kind of like if I was a 90s post-structuralist, I would say it's structurally queer.
Yeah, it's very odd looking.
The parody TV show in BoJack Horseman. Like,
oh yeah, I know it totally is. BoJack Horseman is supposed to be Bob Saget from Full House.
Oh really? Huh.
Or at least that's what it calls out to me as being like primarily based on.
Huh. I see.
Right then.
That's a fucking awesome show, by the way. Holy shit.
What show? What show are we talking about?
BoJack Horseman.
BoJack Horseman.
BoJack Horseman. It's some of the best comedic writing you'll see in. Like it starts out like middle-aged man being depressed and being an asshole kind of humor, sort of like Archer and stuff. But
he's also a horse.
Who's also a horse,
yeah.
But very quickly goes much deeper than that. And holy shit!
Well, as interesting as BoJack Horseman would be,
anyway, y'all gotta watch it.
we should get into the price value distinction and what happens in Capital Volume 3.
We should get Emmanuel, if you could put together a table about BoJack Horseman, that'd be great.
I love you, Tom, but
everyone hates it's a fine line.
All right, so who else we got? We got Melmoth, we got Dylan, we got Oh Man Amp, and we got the return of Antagonist 1 DZ. DZ probably stands for Discovery Zone. That's my feeling. We got Datalore de la Terra. What's up?
Datalore, yay.
Benjamin Hanshoe. Yeah. And I think that's an exhaustive list of our visitors, if I'm not mistaken.
It is.
All right. Awesome.
And Antagonist 1 DZ. You bring up so many interesting points in the chat, but I have no idea what you're saying. Like, you have to send us a paper.
Well, he has sent me a few things, and Tom a few things.
He sent me a paper last week, which I am putting off, but we will do, but I'm not going to do it yet.
Because your claims seem very thought out and very well read, but I have no way of evaluating them or even sort of understanding what it is exactly that you're critiquing. It's obvious that you're not in agreement, and that it seems like you're arguing for a dual system and simultaneous valuation thing.
It
I'm
is
not exactly
it's
sure
not
if that's what you're
not
doing, or if you're just arguing against the book, and I'm not sure how to evaluate the claims that you're making, but I would love to delve more into them, because they're obviously coming from a very very sharp and thought out place.
I mean,
So,
if
Lexi,
I had
give
to,
us a shout.
I'm sorry, if I had to guess where our antagonist is coming from, he seems skeptical of averages, so I doubt that he's a simultaneist. I think the problem that I have with single and dual system as terminology is that, like, I think almost certainly, like, a lot of people in quote dual systems quote theory there are not going to take kindly to being called dual systems. And I guess temporalist and simultaneous has the same problem, but I guess I just think that debate is less legitimate, so I don't care. Like, whereas this one, I think it's important, like how someone like antagonist, sees their conception of Marx's value theory, as not being, dual, which, if you're going by Andrew's account, I think that is how Andrew would classify our antagonist.
Could be. I'm just saying it's unclear from the chat, but it's very clear that our antagonist knows a lot of stuff that we don't know. So yeah, send it our way. I'd love to understand more of your antagonisms, as it were, or reservations.
Okay, well, let's take it offline, and we hopefully will have more interactions offline, and we can put some together about what antagonist is saying to us off air and both in the chat. And we can do, say, an episode or part of an episode where we deal with those issues. Does that sound fair?
Tom, are you saying that we're going to go off air to discuss a member in the chat behind their back?
No. Of course I am. No, I just mean, like, the show, we're just now about somebody's intentions, and I'm going to have to edit this, and I don't want to have to listen to 45 minutes of us talking at the end.
I always just chop off the chat part, honestly, just because I love the chat part, but it's sort of just where you cut loose. That's all.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Okay, yeah. Look, I don't know exactly what. I think that antagonist certainly last time was saying that he thinks that what it's in this book is not a fair representation of what Schaffer's theory is. Okay. And I don't know if he's saying he agrees with Schaffer's theory, but he is basically saying what his problems, like, he thinks that this book does not deal with some of Schaffer's critiques of Marx.
Did you just assume their gender, Tom?
Well, I know who it is. So.
No one actually says that, Emmanuel.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
No, I actually know. I know who it is, but they're not putting their name in the chat, so I won't say their name. So
right, okay.
I definitely think that antagonist, when he says that the book assumes that real wages equal subsistence wages, I didn't see any part in the book where it said that.
Well, I think what he was saying is that that he thought that one of the passages only was incompatible with dual systems theory at a subsistence wage level, and that therefore, that because dual systems theory, and specifically, I think he was alluding to the NI, the new interpretation with the class struggle kind of single system in labor value and in variable capital, that that kind of dual systems theory can accommodate that well outside of the subsistence case. And so I asked him, well, why wouldn't a theory that can cover an ideal, like, and of course not ideal in the normative sense, but ideal in the sense of this probably ain't gonna happen, of subsistence wages, like, wouldn't a theory that can cover even a theoretical limit case like that, wouldn't that be better than a theory that couldn't? Yeah, anyway, that was my counter argument.
But I think that the TSSI is stating that, the value of the means of subsistence can be one thing, but the money that is paid to the worker is another thing. It's not saying that
Yeah.
it's not talking about the magnitude of the wages. It's talking about the magnitude relative to value,
Hmm.
not its absolute magnitude. Yeah, that's what I got from the TSSI on wages. It's just similar to how it values the means of production as the value of the capital advanced, or the money price paid for them. It's not the value of the means of production; it's the money price. Similar with wages, it's not the value of the means; it's the price of the wage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the value comes in with a new value added. That's where price doesn't matter. But in capital outlay, it does, because that's you can't make sense of capital without making sense of taking money into account.
One thing as well, I think that Antagonist has been sending me stuff about, is that he feels that the book only deals with one commodity core models, and that they don't make sense when you come to determining prices, which is like the Schraff's core of Schraff's theory. So what I take from that, what I would say is that I feel like that this book is not really an attack on Schraffa, if you know what I mean. It's an attack on Marxists taking components of elements of Schraffa's work, if you know what I mean. This idea of simultaneously doing, and attacking that, not so much looking at his opus magnus of commodities, production of commodities by commodities. He's not analyzing that book and taking it apart. He's trying to take those influences of certain Schraffian parts and dealing with them with respect to Marx.
I kind of don't get it though. Don't Schraffians use the one good models all the time, or is that just in attempts to refute Marxist arguments?
Yeah, I thought
I haven't read it, so I can't tell.
The point of the production of commodities by commodities is.
Have you read it, Manuel?
I haven't, but I've only read secondary literature that does not come from a Marxist camp, that comes from a Straussian or even neoclassical camp. So it's not like I'm reading it through Andrew's eyes specifically, but I mean, all right, okay, Kleiman could be wrong about Straffa, but it's like the one thing I would say to your point there, Tom, is I think I mean Kleiman's point is actually a bit stronger than that, because he does say that all simultaneous theories boil down to physicalism.
Yeah,
so he is saying that Straffa is a physicalist, but I'm not sure that our antagonists thinks that Straffa is a physicalist, and I'm not sure that he, since it's a he, and we know who this person is, obviously.
Of course, the noted Trotskyist sports writer Dave Zirin.
Right. Okay. I'm sorry. My point with the assuming gender thing was just to preserve anonymity. I hope you didn't take offense.
Yeah, author of "Say My Name, Fool."
Right.
No, I think.
But
could
also,
also,
it's.
could it not be a robot or a Russian bot? Perhaps it could be a Russian bot. So we should be using
this is just a botnet trying to sabotage Marx's value theory and election.
Regardless.
The Russians are everywhere.
I'm still not sure what his point is. Is it that? So last time it was about the vectors, something or other, determining the ratios.
Okay.
between the
Look, I think
commodities.
we're just rambling here. Why don't we just just
I'm not. I need more info. Damn it! I need
Well-
to know where they're coming from. What do you mean?
Well, I think that what Tom was saying about doing like a sort of like, I don't know, like criticisms episode like after we finish the book is probably going to be the most constructive way to handle these like little bite-sized like arguments that we've been getting here and there. Like I encourage our antagonists to think of, you know, what the best stuff we could be reading for a critique episode would be. And you know, before we move on to another like way of doing Marxist economics.
Yeah.
I think that's precisely correct. Look, let's just take it offline. But I say thanks to everybody, and we can start away because, we might as well just do it off air as on air because we're just waffling.
All right.
Everybody. Thanks
Good night,
very
y'all.
much for,
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks to the chat. And who's still alive in there? Oman Damp and Antagonist. Thanks for joining in. And I think there might be data lore might be still around there. Okay, we'll let you go and we'll talk to you next time on the TSSI series, bringing Marx back to life. Yo, motherfuckers, boo, 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 yeah.